Hello and welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm talking again about the statement we have to use ancient standards of reliability in reading, interpreting, and evaluating the Gospels. As you'll remember if you listened to last week's show, I argued that that's false, surprising as that may sound. I'm going to recap briefly what I said there. I said there that when we talk about using ancient standards of reliability and insisting that we have to do that, we're conflating evaluation and information. We all want to have information, and we should. So even if the gospel authors did use what I've called elsewhere fact-changing literary devices, we should want to know that. That's something we should want to know. But it doesn't follow that it's no big deal, that it makes no difference to anything that we should care about. That is a matter of evaluation and is completely separate from knowing that they were doing something or knowing that something was allowed at the time, etc. Even if it was allowed at the time, it doesn't follow that it's no big deal. The second thing that I said last time was that there's actually a kind of a incoherence in that statement that we have to use ancient standards of reliability. It arises because if the supposed ancient standard is sufficiently different to be called a different standard of reliability, the question arises why we should use the term reliability or its cognates to talk about it among ourselves. Obviously, the English word reliability didn't exist at that time, so why is it a good description of what they were doing? Even if we grant that they thought this was okay, it doesn't follow that that's a good way to communicate about it among ourselves. So when we're talking to each other and we're using the term reliable, we should use it in the sense that others will understand it, not give some strange, different definition to it. So there's an inherent incoherence in saying this was sufficiently similar that reliable and its cognates are good translations for the concept, good ways to describe the concept, but it was so different that you need to be specially educated about it. Okay. Now, it might seem that this point is most important when we're talking about people using it to justify attributing fact-changing literary devices, because those are arguably a relatively big deal. I've certainly argued that they're a big deal. And so a major concern is that this use of this statement, we have to use ancient standards of reliability, is a way to induce people to accept fact-changing literary devices without giving the evidence for them due consideration. That's certainly important, and I would say that applies no matter what you're using the phrase to describe. But someone might say, well, what if I'm using the phrase to describe something that really isn't a big deal, that even my audience wouldn't consider, my modern audience wouldn't consider a big deal, like a narrowly defined figure of speech. Okay, if Jesus says if your eye offends you, pluck it out, he's using hyperbole. He's not really saying you need to pluck out your eye. And why can't I use ancient standards of reliability for something like that nobody is going to consider to be a big deal? Isn't that okay? And I want to talk about why that's still not a good phrase, a good sentence or statement to use today. So I want to start with the fact that we need to decide what something means before we can evaluate how it intersects with reliability. And I'm using reliability here just in some kind of a normal, modern sense. Okay, I'm not redefining it at all. But before deciding how a proposition in a source, whether that's a person or a book or whatever, influences the reliability of that source, the factual reliability, I have to decide what the sentence means. Okay, so to put this in very simple modern terms, if I say, Jim has a frog in his throat tonight, in order to decide whether that statement is true or false, which is necessary to decide how it impacts my reliability, we have to decide what it means. And we need to know that that's a figure of speech for the statement that the person is kind of hoarse. I sometimes have a bit of a frog in my throat. So it doesn't have to do with the idea that he has an actual literal frog in his throat. Okay, so precisely because something like that is no big deal, the way in which it's no big deal is that it influences the sheer propositional meaning of the statement. And that's why we shouldn't call it a different standard of reliability. If in the English language we have the phrase, I have a frog in my throat, which is an idiom, that doesn't mean that we have a different standard of reliability from some other language. I don't know, let's suppose that modern Italian doesn't use the idiom, I have a frog in my throat, for a hoarse voice. Does that mean that Italians and Americans have a different standard of reliability? No, it just means that American English has an idiom that you don't find in Italian. So that would be a very confusing way to talk about it. Okay, so by illustrating that with a simple idiom, the very fact that that is no big deal is an illustration of why we shouldn't use different standards of reliability to describe it, because it just influences what the sentence means. Something similar is true of the statement in the Gospels, for example, that Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. In order to decide how that influences the reliability of the Gospels, we need to know just at the very garden variety, the very boring level, what it means. Not some deep higher meaning, but just, what does it mean? Does it mean that Pilate personally wielded the whip? Well, now, in that case, we actually do have a modern idiom that corresponds to it. But set that aside. The point is, you realize in the context that the phrase so-and-so did this, like scourged somebody, built a synagogue, etc., can be used when the person caused it to be done or ordered it to be done. In modern terms, if I said Jim and Judy built a house out by the lake, and we're not in Little House on the Prairie, you figured that Jim and Judy hired a contractor to build the house. So how that influences reliability depends on what it means at a very garden variety level. So I need to know what it means to say that Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. That's not a different standard of reliability, even if we compare it to some language and culture where they don't use that idiom of saying so-and-so scourged or so-and-so built to mean that so-and-so caused it to be done. It's just a different meaning for that type of sentence than someone in that other culture might take it to be. So you explain that, then you just evaluate reliability in the ordinary way. Once you know what it means, you can decide if it's true or not, and then decide how that impacts reliability. Let's take this to a slightly more complicated term or usage. Suppose we're talking about order of narration in a book. Now, please see my other videos or read The Mirror or The Mask if you prefer to read. Please look into this. Briefly, I've distinguished achronological narration, that's my coinage, from dyschronological narration. Achronological narration is related to the intention of the speaker or the author, where the speaker of the author is not intending to imply or to state an order of events. It can also apply where the person isn't intending to imply a specific length of time that the events took. Now, we do, in fact, use achronological narration. I haven't even decided whether the ancients tended to use it more often than we do. If they did, so what? But it's not hard to understand. If I say, yesterday I went to the grocery store and I prepared dinner, I'm not intending to imply, let's say I'm not intending to imply that I went to the grocery store before I prepared dinner. I might very well not be, because I just used the word and to connect it. Now, this can be difficult to decide. Sometimes you might use narrative order with the intention of implying chronological order. So we have to take context into consideration. We have to try to decide. And this applies to a lot of the alleged contradictions in the Gospels. Now, this is especially important because if the authors did intend always to imply chronological order, then you end up with contradictions. Luke narrates the temptations in the wilderness, just using and, in a different order than Matthew narrates them in. But it's very simple to conjecture, and it's not a implausible conjecture, that Luke didn't intend to be implying that they happened in just this order. If there really were a contradiction, then that would influence reliability. And notice that if Luke changed it deliberately, then there would be a contradiction. Saying that somebody did it deliberately doesn't mean that it's not a contradiction. This is important. So dyschronological narration, which is the other term, occurs when an author deliberately changes the order in which things occur. And then you can end up with a genuine contradiction. And calling it a literary device doesn't help with that, okay? So should we use the phrase a different standard of reliability to refer to achronological narration? No, because once again, though in a slightly different way from a simple idiom, to decide how something influences reliability, we first have to decide what it means. And if Luke didn't mean, by connecting those with, these simple conjunctions, to imply that they happened in that order, then that's relevant to whether he has the order incorrect, okay? Which is relevant to his reliability. And here we haven't had to change the term reliability. We haven't had to use a different standard of reliability. We're just applying the same use of reliability that we would imply otherwise. But we first decide what Luke meant to say. What was the meaning of the connectives between between Jesus' different temptations in the wilderness? Same principle. The very fact that something is no big deal, that these are things that, are going to be uncontroversial once they're pointed out or explained, means that they concern just the meaning of the sentence in a very garden variety, unexciting, unsexy sense, which we must determine before we discuss reliability at all, and then the concept of reliability isn't something we change. Okay. Third thing I'm going to illustrate, rounding conventions. I often think that when people talk about ancient standards of reliability, they are talking about things like, or they think they're talking about things like approximation and rounding conventions. And then other people come along and use it for fact-changing literary devices, but the audience assume, well, we're talking about something like rounding conventions, or if I say something but without explicitly saying it, I mean it was about this time or about this age or about this many or whatever. And they think, well, yeah, when they say ancient standards of reliability, that's what they mean. Now, Craig Blomberg has suggested, and I'm sure there are other people who have suggested this as well, that it looks like in some of the Gospels, when they are talking about time, specifically that context, they seem sometimes to be rounding the time to the nearest multiple of 3. The 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, for example. Okay? Because so often, I believe the Gospel of John is the only Gospel that contains some exceptions to this. So often you'll find that when an hour is given, it's a multiple of 3. Now, what that could mean is that when one of those authors says the 6th hour, he might mean anything from, 10:30 in the morning till 1:30 in the afternoon, okay? Because let's assume he's using the system, and this is another question, the system of numbering the hours where it starts at 6 a.m., the 6th hour would be noon, but even if he doesn't say about, he means about, because, you don't have precise watches and so forth. And so you're going by the sun, and, the 6th hour can be a fairly broad range of times because you're estimating it. And that rounding, let's say, to the nearest multiple of 3 could be a convention. You definitely should not call that a different ancient standard of reliability, because once again, you need to decide what is meant. What is meant by the 6th hour? If what's meant by the 6th hour is, well, somewhere approximately in between, 11 and 1 or 10:30 and 1:30 or whatever, then if you see an apparent contradiction with something else, maybe that's what's going on, and so neither one is wrong once we understand what they meant. But we're trying to understand what they meant. Now, Dr. Blomberg uses this for the alleged contradiction between John and Mark on the time of Jesus' crucifixion. I lean towards instead an early actual textual copying error in the Gospel of John. I think that's a better explanation there. But it's understandable that he would use this rounding issue to try to harmonize there. But notice that is harmonization. That's not teaching us about ancient standards of reliability. It's just teaching us about what's meant by a reference to an hour. Now, we need to know things like the range of time. In this case, it's time. It might be something else somewhere else. But the range to which the rounding refers, okay, it could be between this and this. We need to know what context that applies to, because I don't think we have any evidence of rounding to the nearest multiple of 3 in contexts other than time, okay? And sometimes, by the way, even John will give times other than a multiple of 3, which I think shows that he's trying to be even more specific, even more precise. And we need to know where this is going to be relevant, and we need to use then context to try to decide if it's relevant. Notice that it would be a bad generalization, similar to there were different ancient standards of reliability, to just wave your hands and say the ancients were less interested in precision than we are. I mean, we've got lots of evidence that that isn't true. John's Gospel alone gives specific numbers of years, times, gallons, distances that don't appear to be rounded to some conventional number at all. Okay, and definitely shows an interest in precision even with regard to numbers. Luke distinguishes the sycamore tree from the sycamine tree, even though they sound similar in Greek, showing an interest in precision in naming a tree. Okay, so the generalization that the ancients were less interested in precision than we are is probably false, but it also guides our minds away from understanding meaning. Okay, so by finding out what's being claimed and where it applies, interestingly, we actually gain more information. A generalization like the ancients were less interested in precision, or a confusing and even inherently contradictory statement like they used really important different standards of reliability, it's a kind of intellectual laziness, and it leads us to be less informed, because we're not asking what exactly do you mean, How does that apply to the passage in front of me? Let's get clear on this, and what's our evidence for it? Okay, even a number like 40, which some might tell you is conventional, sometimes is used to mean something pretty precise. So when Luke says it was 40 days between Jesus' resurrection and the ascension in Acts 1, he says that. When you look at the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Pentecost, when Luke says that the Holy Spirit came, and Jesus says that they'll be given the Holy Spirit not many days from now, and then he ascends into heaven, you get that Luke actually means to be referring to something that was approximately 40 days, 6 weeks, maybe not to the day, but it's not just some number that has no meaning because, 40 is conventional and theologically significant. So we need to inquire more. We need to ask more questions. By investigating this and not using phrases like, we need to use ancient standards of reliability, we're not hiding our heads in the sand. We're not advocating ignorance and blind anachronism and just assuming that everything means the same thing and being uninformed about figures of speech and so forth. On the contrary, we're advocating being more informed and better informed, and that makes us better able to inform other people. Come back next time to the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.